Scary stories of abandoned bus stops. The bus stop was empty when they found her backpack, but the bus schedule had something strange about it. Every departure time was scratched out, except for one, midnight. And when they checked the security footage, there was no sign of her, only the flickering streetlight and the shadow standing under it. At the edge of town, where the streetlights barely glow and the trees swallow the roads whole, there's a bus stop no one talks about. In every small town, there are places where the world seems thinner, where reality itself feels brittle, like a piece of glass about to shatter. On the outskirts of our town, just beyond the last gas station and past a grove of skeletal oak trees, stands the old Whitaker bus stop. Its roof is sagging, weighed down by years of rain and moss, and the once bright yellow paint has dulled into a sickly, peeling gray. Most people who drive past it don't even notice it anymore. It's just another forgotten remnant of a route abandoned decades ago. But the few who do notice, those who really look at it, say there's something wrong about the place. Some blame it on the smell. The air around the bus stop always carries a faint odor of rot, like something organic has seeped into the ground beneath it. Others point to the graffiti that coats the walls, not just spray paint, but deep carvings etched into the wood and metal. Words that make no sense, sometimes in languages no one recognizes. But the locals, they all agree on one thing: don't wait there after dark, especially not at midnight. Maddie was a skeptic. She didn't buy into small-town superstitions, didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or the eerie rules everyone seemed to whisper about. At 18, she was determined to shake off the dust of her hometown and leave it all behind. So when her friends dared her to spend 30 minutes alone at the bus stop after dark, she didn't hesitate. "It's just a bench and some busted streetlights," she had scoffed, flipping her long brown hair over her shoulder. What's the worst that could happen? It was a cold night when Maddie arrived, her jacket zipped tightly against the chill. Her friends had parked a block away, staying behind to watch her live stream the entire event. The plan was simple. She'd sit on the bench, start streaming, and wait for 30 minutes. No big deal. Easy money for the bet. But as she approached the bus stop, a sense of unease crept over her. The surrounding trees seemed unnaturally still, their branches hanging heavy like frozen limbs. The sound of her sneakers crunching gravel echoed far louder than it should have in the quiet night. And the bench, oh, the bench, looked far worse up close. The wood was warped and blackened, as if scorched, with chunks missing from the edges. Faded gum wrappers and cigarette butts littered the ground. And above her, the streetlight flickered with a weak, sickly glow. She shook off her discomfort and sat down, pulling out her phone to start the stream. "Hey everyone," she began, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to her. "So, I'm here at the super scary Whitaker bus stop. And guess what? It's just a bunch of crap. There's nothing here to be afraid of." Her audience seemed to disagree. Comments flooded in almost immediately, warning her to leave, joking about ghosts in the shadows or demons hiding in the trees. She rolled her eyes, but the hairs on the back of her neck were already standing up. The air was strange, heavy, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it felt like the world around her had gone silent. No wind, no crickets, not even the distant hum of traffic, just nothing. The graffiti on the walls caught her attention. It wasn't random, not the usual tags or crude drawings she'd expected. Instead, the words scratched into the wood seemed deliberate, purposeful. One phrase, repeated over and over in jagged letters, stood out: "Don't wait for the midnight bus." The words were crude, uneven, as if carved by someone in a hurry, or someone who was terrified. Maddie leaned closer to trace the letters with her finger, and for a moment she thought she felt something sticky, almost like sap, oozing from the grooves. She pulled her hand back quickly, wiping it on her jeans, but the feeling lingered, making her skin crawl. The comments on her live stream had shifted. "Do you hear that?" One read. "What's with the light?" Another said. Maddie frowned and glanced up at the streetlight. It was flickering faster now, the light stuttering in and out like a heartbeat. She laughed nervously, pointing her phone up at it. "I guess they don't replace the bulbs out here," she joked. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then the dripping started. It was faint at first, a soft patter that she thought was just rain. She looked around, confused. The sky was clear, the stars bright above her, yet the sound grew louder, closer. She glanced down and froze. Puddles had begun forming beneath the bench, dark and viscous, spreading outwards like ink. They didn't ripple or move like water. They just grew, swallowing the gravel beneath them. And the smell? Oh, the smell. It was rancid, a mix of decaying leaves and something far worse. Maddie's breath quickened as she panned her phone's light across the ground, searching for an explanation. "Okay, this is getting weird," she said, her voice shaky. The chat exploded with comments. "Leave now!" "Run!" But she didn't move. Her pride kept her glued to the bench, even as her gut screamed at her to go. That's when she felt it. A sudden drop in temperature, so sharp it felt like stepping into a freezer. The air seemed to press in around her, and for the first time, she realized how alone she was. Her friends were too far to hear her if she screamed. The road ahead was empty, and the trees, they seemed closer now, their branches arching inward like skeletal fingers reaching for her. Somewhere in the darkness, a sound echoed. A low, groaning creak, like the hinges of a door slowly opening. Maddie's heart pounded as she clutched her phone tighter, the beam of light trembling in her hand. "Hello?" she called, her voice cracking. The only response was the flickering of the streetlight above her, casting jagged, dancing shadows across the bench. One shadow moved. Not the kind of movement you'd expect from a trick of the light. This was deliberate, purposeful. It slid across the ground, stretching unnaturally, its shape long and distorted. Maddie froze, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. And then, as the shadow stretched toward her feet, she felt it again. The dripping. Only this time it wasn't coming from the bench, it was coming from above. She started the stream, laughing nervously as she shined her phone's light across the bench. The graffiti looked older up close, scratched deep into the wood like claw marks. But something was strange. Each time she moved the light, the shadows seemed to cling to the edges of her vision, twisting unnaturally. Her viewers flooded the chat. "What's behind you?" Maddie froze. The only thing behind her was the road, stretching into the darkness. She turned, her breath catching as the streetlight flickered once, twice, and then everything went black. Maddie's laughter, forced and hollow, echoed in the stillness around her as she steadied the trembling light of her phone. "Well, this is a bust," she muttered into the camera, trying to convince herself that the growing sense of dread in her chest was just nerves, nothing more. But even as the words left her lips, her pulse quickened. She kept panning the light across the bench, pretending not to notice how the graffiti seemed far too deliberate for a place like this. No random doodles or profanities. Instead, jagged lines dug deep into the wood, each carving more desperate than the last. Her audience was growing. The number of viewers ticked upward in the corner of her screen, accompanied by a steady flow of comments. "Get out of there. Turn around. What's that in the background?" Maddie squinted at the screen, her brow furrowing. "What are you guys talking about?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder into the empty stretch of road behind her. There was nothing there, just the faint silhouette of trees shrouded in shadow, their branches weaving together to form an impenetrable canopy. The streetlight above her buzzed faintly, its flickering casting the bench and the road in stuttering flashes of dim yellow light. Each time it blinked out, the darkness seemed to stretch further, pulling at the edges of the world. Maddie adjusted her phone, the small beam of light from the camera feeling woefully inadequate. "Okay, you guys are freaking me out," she said with a nervous laugh, trying to dismiss the unease creeping into her voice. And then the shadows began to move. At first it was subtle, an almost imperceptible shift, like the wind stirring leaves that weren't there. Maddie's phone light darted across the ground, catching glimpses of the dark puddles still spreading beneath her feet. They weren't behaving like water. Instead of reflecting the light, They seemed to swallow it, pulling the glow into their inky depths. She aimed the camera at the ground, frowning. Is it oil? What the hell is that? Her audience was no longer playful. The comments came rapid fire now, almost frantic. Behind you. Something's moving. Maddie whipped her head around again, the phone light jerking wildly. Her stomach dropped. The road was still empty, but the trees no longer felt distant. Their branches stretched farther into the road, their outlines impossibly jagged. She swore they hadn't been that close when she arrived. The streetlight flickered more violently, its buzzing growing louder, angrier, until with a sharp crack, it went out completely. Maddie's world plunged into darkness. For a moment, the only sound was her own breathing, ragged and shallow. The blackness was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. She fumbled with her phone, the screen illuminating her pale face as she tried to adjust the light. "Okay, this is officially not funny anymore," she said, her voice quivering. "If one of you guys set this up, I swear to God." And then she heard it started as a faint rustling, like dry leaves scraping against pavement. Maddie froze, the phone light trembling in her grip as she swung it toward the source of the noise. The beam illuminated the edge of the bench, the gnarled wood glistening with moisture. The sound grew louder, sharper, until it was unmistakable. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, splashing faintly in the puddles around her. Maddie's chest tightened as she pointed the camera toward the road, her voice barely a whisper. "Who's there?" The darkness didn't answer, but the footsteps kept coming, closer now, each one heavier than the last. The light from her phone barely pierced the blackness, revealing nothing but the empty road ahead. Yet she could feel it. Something was out there, watching her, closing the distance. Her viewers knew it too. The chat had devolved into a frenzy. "It's right there. Oh my God, run!" Maddie's breath hitched as she turned the camera back to the bench. Her light caught a glimmer of something wet, dripping from the roof of the bus shelter. But before she could process it, the footsteps stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that hums in your ears, that makes every nerve in your body scream at you to run. Maddie's pulse thundered as she scanned the area, her phone shaking in her hand. The light flickered again, a weak, dying glow barely illuminating the bench. "Hello?" she called, her voice cracking. At first, that's when she thought it was just a trick of the shadows, a smear of blackness darker than the night around it. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized it wasn't a shadow. It was a shape, hunched and unnatural, crouching just beyond the edge of the light. Its limbs were long and thin, bending at angles that made her stomach churn. Its head jerked toward her, the motion sharp and inhuman, and for the first time she saw its face, or the lack of one. Two hollow voids stared back at her where eyes should have been, oozing a thick black substance that dripped onto the pavement. Its mouth, if it could even be called that, was a gaping slit that stretched too wide, lined with jagged teeth that seemed to pulse in the faint light. Maddie froze, every muscle in her body locking in place as the creature tilted its head, as if studying her. Her phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the ground and shattering the silence. The screen landed face up, the live stream still running. The camera caught one final fleeting image, the thing stepping into the light, its shadow stretching toward her like claws. And then everything went black. The darkness wasn't empty. It hummed. Maddie's pulse thundered in her ears as she stared into the void where the streetlight had been. "It's just the power," she whispered to herself, gripping her phone tighter. But then she heard it. Faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, splashing in the puddles behind the bus stop. She spun around, her phone shaking in her hand. The chat was exploding. "Leave now. Someone's there." But Maddie couldn't move. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a sound that made her stomach turn. A wet, gurgling noise like something struggling to breathe. And then she saw it. The moment the streetlight went out, Maddie's world collapsed into a dense, oppressive blackness. It wasn't just the absence of light. It felt alive, as though the darkness itself had mass, pressing in on her, filling the air with a heavy, suffocating presence. Her breaths came shallow and fast, her chest heaving as she tried to keep herself calm. "The power's out. It's just the power," she muttered under her breath, though her words felt flimsy, useless against the primal fear gripping her. But then came the humming. It wasn't a sound at first. Not really. It was more of a vibration, a low, bone-deep resonance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was faint but growing, creeping into her ears, her chest, her skull. Maddie clenched her teeth, trying to shake the sensation, but it was inside her now, slithering like an itch she couldn't scratch. She gripped her phone tightly, the tiny screen her only source of light, and pointed it toward the street. The puddles, which had been stagnant moments ago, were rippling. The oily black pools beneath the bench shimmered faintly in the glow of her phone, their surfaces breaking into concentric rings as though disturbed by unseen footsteps. Maddie's fingers trembled as she raised the camera higher, her breath hitching when she heard it. A faint splash. The sound came from behind the bus stop. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A deliberate, measured step in the water. Maddie's mind raced. There was no one else around. She checked the road, the surrounding trees. She was alone, wasn't she? "Hello?" Her voice was barely audible, more of a squeak than a question. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, Maddie thought she'd imagined it. Her rational mind fought to take control, assuring her that it was probably just an animal, a raccoon, a stray dog. But deep down, she knew. The weight in the air, the humming in her skull, the way the shadows seemed to shift and breathe, it all screamed that this was something else. And then came the gurgling. It was a sickening, wet sound, like thick mud being churned underfoot or water bubbling up from a clogged drain. Maddie froze, her phone aimed unsteadily toward the bench. The noise was behind her now, growing louder, closer. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a dreadful, suffocating thing that made her skin crawl and her stomach churn. She turned slowly, her movements jerky and hesitant, as if any sudden motion would trigger whatever was lurking in the darkness. Her phone's beam cut through the black, illuminating the edge of the bench. The graffiti carved deep into its surface, and the puddles now spreading like veins across the ground. The chat was frantic, a blur of messages scrolling too fast for her to read, but a single comment caught her eye. "It's behind you." Her blood ran cold. Maddie turned sharply, her phone's light darting toward the road. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless stretch of asphalt swallowed by the night. She let out a shaky breath, her grip on the phone loosening slightly. "Okay," she whispered to herself. "This is just..." The light caught movement. At the far edge of the bus stop, just beyond the reach of her phone's beam, a shadow flickered. It wasn't like the others. This one moved with intent, shifting slowly, deliberately. It was low to the ground, its limbs long and angular, dragging across the pavement with an unnatural fluidity. Maddie's breath hitched as the shape began to rise, unfolding itself like a grotesque puppet being pulled upright by invisible strings. She couldn't make out its features, but its silhouette was all wrong. The head was misshapen, tilting sharply to one side, and its arms were grotesquely elongated, the fingers stretching impossibly long, almost brushing the ground. It swayed slightly, its movements jerky and uncoordinated, as though it was trying to remember how to move. Maddie stumbled back, her phone slipping in her sweaty grip. What the hell? The gurgling sound grew louder, reverberating through the air. The figure took a step forward, its movements unnatural, as though each joint bent in the wrong direction. Maddie's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead, her body paralyzed by a primal fear she couldn't control. And then, it looked at her. The thing tilted its head toward the light, and Maddie's heart stopped. Where eyes should have been, there were only hollow pits, black and oozing, the thick liquid dripping slowly onto the pavement. Its mouth was a gaping maw, impossibly wide and lined with jagged, uneven teeth that seemed to pulse as it breathed. Her phone buzzed violently in her hand, snapping her out of her trance. She glanced down at the screen and her stomach turned. The image was glitching, the live stream cutting in and out. But for a brief second, the comments were clear. "It sees you." The thing lunged. Maddie screamed, dropping her phone as she stumbled backward, her foot catching on the edge of the bench. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. The phone skittered across the pavement, landing face up, its camera pointed toward the sky. She scrambled to her feet, her vision blurred by panic and tears. The gurgling stopped. The silence was worse. Maddie reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling as she grabbed it and swung the light back toward the bench. The figure was gone. But the puddles, it was as though they were alive, spreading rapidly, their inky blackness seeping toward her. Her phone buzzed again, and she looked down at the screen. The chat had stopped. All the comments, the frantic warnings, were gone. In their place was a single phrase repeated over and over: "Don't let it touch you." The puddles were at her feet now, the oily liquid bubbling and hissing as it reached her shoes. Maddie screamed, jerking away as the darkness seemed to reach for her, its tendrils stretching impossibly long. And then she heard it again. Footsteps. Only this time they weren't slow. They were running toward her. At first, it was just a shape in the shadows. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized it wasn't a person. Its body was wrong, hunched and elongated, its arms too long for its torso. It swayed, its head tilted at an impossible angle, and its eyes, two hollow pits, seemed to follow her as she moved. Kyle's breath quickened as the shadow stretched toward him, its edges writhing like smoke. He backed away, but the puddles were spreading now, creeping up his legs, cold and slimy like fingers dragging him down. For a moment, Maddie was too terrified to process what she was seeing. The figure at the edge of her vision seemed wrong in every conceivable way. At first glance, it resembled a person, but only just. Its hunched frame was grotesquely exaggerated, its back arched as if the very act of standing upright was unnatural. Its arms, long and spindly, hung low, the fingers impossibly thin and sharp, twitching faintly as though testing the air. The way it swayed sent chills crawling down Maddie's spine, like it was studying her, deciding how to move next. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a slow step back. She told herself to breathe, to focus, but it was nearly impossible to think clearly with the oppressive, suffocating presence of the thing looming in front of her. It wasn't just its appearance. It was the feeling, a primal, bone-deep dread that clawed at her insides, telling her she wasn't meant to be here, wasn't supposed to see this. The light from her phone flickered weakly, casting erratic beams across the puddles beneath her. They seemed to writhe now, the liquid thick and viscous, almost alive as it crept closer to her sneakers. The smell grew stronger, an acrid, metallic stench that made her stomach churn and her throat tighten. Maddie swallowed hard, fighting back the urge to gag as her gaze snapped back to the figure. Its head jerked suddenly, the motion sharp and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. Maddie gasped, her breath catching as its eyeless face locked onto her. The hollow sockets weren't just empty, they seemed to pulse, oozing a dark, tar-like substance that dripped down its face and disappeared into the puddles below. The thing's mouth opened slowly, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth, and for a moment, she thought it might scream. But instead, it made a sound, a deep, guttural clicking noise that seemed to reverberate inside her skull. Her hands shook violently as she tightened her grip on her phone. The beam of light trembled, bouncing across the creature's malformed body. The more she saw, the less human it became. Its skin, or whatever covered its body, was thin and stretched taut, like old parchment barely clinging to jagged bones. Dark veins pulsed beneath the surface, moving unnaturally, as though the thing's body was alive with something crawling just beneath the skin. And then it started to move. Maddie's legs nearly buckled as the figure began to advance. Its limbs didn't move like a person's. They jerked and snapped, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The creature's feet, Or were they hands slapped wetly against the ground, each step accompanied by the sickening squelch of the puddles beneath it? Its body twisted unnaturally as it closed the distance, the sound of its movements wet and deliberate, like flesh peeling off bone. "No," Maddie whispered, shaking her head. She stumbled back, her shoes skidding on the slick pavement. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her body refused to obey. It was like the air itself had thickened, weighing her down, rooting her in place as the creature loomed closer. The chat on her live stream exploded again, but Maddie couldn't tear her eyes away from the thing long enough to read it. Her viewers were panicking, begging her to run, but their words felt distant, like they were coming from another world entirely. All she could focus on was the creature, its swaying, jerking movements, the way its shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally across the ground, and those hollow, dripping eyes that never left her. The puddles surged forward, reaching her feet. The cold, slimy liquid seeped into her shoes, and Maddie let out a strangled cry as it climbed up her ankles like fingers, cold and wet and alive. She kicked wildly, stumbling backward, but the puddles only tightened their grip, pulling her down with relentless, bone-chilling strength. The creature stopped, tilting its head again, as if amused by her struggle. The clicking sound returned, louder now, echoing in the empty air. Maddie's chest heaved as panic overtook her, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. She clawed at the ground, trying to pull herself free, but the puddles clung to her, dragging her closer to the creature. It was only a few feet away now. Maddie could see every grotesque detail of its face, or what should have been its face. The jagged teeth glistened, dripping with the same black substance that oozed from its eyes. Its skin writhed, as if something inside it was moving, pressing against the surface, trying to escape. Her phone buzzed violently in her hand, and for a brief moment she tore her gaze away to glance at the screen. The camera had captured the creature in stark, horrifying detail, but the image was glitching, distorting as though the thing's very presence was warping reality. And then the comments appeared again, flooding the screen with a single message repeated over and over. "It's feeding." Maddie's stomach turned as the creature opened its mouth wider, an unholy, yawning chasm that seemed to stretch far beyond what was physically possible. A low, guttural growl emanated from deep within it, vibrating through the ground and up into her chest. The puddles surged again, dragging her closer, and for the first time Maddie screamed. It was a raw, primal sound, filled with terror and desperation, but it did nothing to stop the creature's advance. It crouched now, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it reached for her. Its fingers, long, thin and tipped with sharp, glistening points, hovered just inches from her face. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper, and Maddie realized with a sickening clarity that she was about to die. But then, the creature stopped. Its head snapped to the side, as if listening to something Maddie couldn't hear. The clicking noise faded, replaced by a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath her. Maddie's heart pounded as the creature straightened, its movements sharp and sudden, like a puppet being yanked on its strings. And then, without warning, it melted into the shadows. One moment it was there, towering over her, and the next, it was gone, dissolving into the inky blackness, as if it had never been there at all. But the puddles remained, and they were still pulling her down. The next morning, a passing driver spotted Kyle's phone lying in the middle of the road, screen cracked and covered in mud. The bus stop looked as it always did, desolate, quiet, forgotten. But there was something new on the bench, a puddle, dark and thick, slowly dripping onto the ground below, and carved into the rotting wood, barely visible through the grime, were the words, "It watches. Nobody sits there anymore. Nobody dares." But sometimes, late at night, you can still hear the rain, and if you're brave enough to look, you might just see the shadow watching you from the corner of your eye. But whatever you do, don't blink. Antadai Naiko. The morning broke gray and lifeless, the kind of dawn that seems reluctant to shed the weight of night. The sky hung low with thick, unmoving clouds, and the air was damp, heavy with the smell of rain that hadn't fallen. The roads were slick, dark ribbons winding through the outskirts of town, flanked by skeletal trees that swayed faintly in the breeze. A lone car rumbled down the empty road, its headlights slicing through the gloom. Inside, the driver, a middle-aged man named Frank, hummed distractedly to the faint crackle of talk radio. Frank didn't notice the bus stop at first. It was just another forgotten relic on his early morning route to work, blending into the monotony of the landscape. But as his car neared the bend, something caught his eye, a faint glimmer on the road ahead. His tires splashed through shallow puddles as he slowed, leaning forward in his seat to get a better look. There, in the middle of the road, was a phone. Frank pulled over, the tires of his car crunching against the gravel shoulder. He left the engine running as he stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. The phone lay face up, its screen spider-webbed with cracks, the casing smeared with mud. For a moment, Frank hesitated. Something about the phone felt wrong, though he couldn't say why. It was just a phone, after all. He bent down and picked it up, wiping the mud off on his jacket. The screen flickered weakly to life, displaying the fractured remnants of what appeared to be a video. Curious, Frank tilted the phone to get a better view. The image was distorted, glitching in and out of focus, but he could make out the faint outline of something. A figure, a face, lurking in the shadows. The audio was garbled, punctuated by faint, wet sounds, and a single chilling phrase repeated over and over. "It watches." A shiver ran down Frank's spine as he looked toward the bus stop just ahead. It sat there, quiet and unassuming, framed by the skeletal remains of long-forgotten trees. The bench was sagging, its wood splintered and blackened, the roof caved in on one side. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the shelter, forming a puddle that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. Frank didn't want to go closer. Every instinct told him to turn around, to leave, to throw the phone back where he found it, and forget he'd ever stopped. But something about the bench drew him in, a strange, almost magnetic pull that he couldn't resist. He took a cautious step forward, his boots squelching in the mud. The puddle beneath the bench seemed to shimmer, its surface unnaturally smooth despite the droplets that fell steadily into it. Frank squinted, leaning closer, and realized with a sickening jolt that the puddle wasn't water. It was thicker, darker, and it smelled faintly of something metallic. His eyes drifted upward, and that's when he saw it. The words were carved deep into the wood of the bench, their jagged edges crusted with grime and something darker, something that looked like dried blood. "It watches." The letters seemed to writhe in the dim light, as though alive, as though the wood itself was trying to warn him. Frank stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. He dropped the phone, and it landed with a splash in the puddle. For a brief, horrible moment, the surface of the puddle rippled unnaturally, forming shapes, long, skeletal fingers, a hollowed-out face, those terrible, oozing eyes. He turned and ran. No one saw Maddie again. The police conducted a cursory investigation, spurred by the frantic calls of her friends who had watched the live stream in real time. But the case quickly went cold. The phone was recovered from Frank, but the video was gone, the device wiped clean by some unknown glitch. The bus stop became a whispered legend, its presence an unspoken warning to those who ventured too close to the edge of town. People avoided the area, though none could quite explain why. It wasn't just fear, it was instinct, a deep primal knowledge that something unnatural lingered there. On quiet nights, when the wind died down and the roads fell silent, some claimed they could hear it, the faint sound of footsteps splashing in puddles, or the low, wet gurgle of something breathing just out of sight. Others swore they saw shadows moving beneath the streetlight, flickering unnaturally, stretching toward the bench. The puddle remained. No matter how dry the season, how hot the summer, the puddle never evaporated. It clung to the ground beneath the bus stop like a stain, its edges dark and slick, spreading ever so slightly each year. And the words, "It watches," never faded. They say if you're brave, or foolish, enough to sit on the bench after dark, you'll feel it. The air will grow heavy, thick with a suffocating pressure that settles in your chest and steals your breath. The shadows will shift, stretching toward you, and you'll hear it. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps splashing in the puddles. No one knows what happens if you stay. But sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the moon is hidden and the wind carries a faint, wet whisper, people swear they see her. Maddie, or something that looks like her. She sits on the bench, her head tilted at an impossible angle, her hollow eyes dripping black ichor onto the ground below. Her lips move soundlessly, forming the same words over and over. "Don't let it see you. Don't let it see you." And if you look too long, if you dare to meet her gaze, they say you'll see it too. The shadow stretching out behind her, growing longer, wider, until it swallows you whole. No one waits for the midnight bus anymore. Did Maddie ever really leave? Or is she still there, waiting for the next fool to join her in the shadows? Tell me, if you passed that bench on a dark, rainy night, would you dare to sit? Did this story send chills down your spine? Make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next terrifying tale. But tell me, if the midnight bus pulled up to your stop, would you step inside? Or would you let it leave without you?